This is the future of water, where we talk about all the ways which companies, utilities, and people are addressing the challenges and opportunities in water. Today, we're going to talk with Bluefield's Eric Bindler about a range of things, including the Utility Management Conference in Atlanta this past week. He and I were both there, albeit for different reasons, and we were fortunate or lucky enough to cross paths. Haven't seen Eric in about a year and a half at least. So it was great to sit outside, have dinner with him, and talk about what's happening in water, among other things. So we'll talk a little bit about the conference proceedings, give some perspective on what we are thinking about utility management and also key trends and takeaways. Also, we're going to talk a little bit about some other digital trends and M&A activity. So I thought I'd take this opportunity. It's been a while since we talked to Eric about that specifically. We'd get his take on a couple notable events that have happened in recent weeks. Sure, we talk about these things internally, but and with clients, but we thought we'd take a chance to share some of it with you. All right. It's been a little while since we did this for a number of different reasons, whether it be scheduling or just too many things to talk about. But I'm going to share a couple news items with you as we try to do. So, number one on the list, Milwaukee-based water technology company A.O. Smith has acquired Pennsylvania-based water treatment company Master Water Conditioning Corporation. This represents A.O. Smith's fifth water treatment acquisition since 2021. That's water treatment within that part of their business. So that adds really to about $459 million in annual revenues. That's what it was in 2020, I believe. So their water treatment, A.O. Smith's water treatment business really includes softeners and filtration. But aside from this acquisition, I thought this was interesting for a number of different reasons. One, I'm intrigued by A.O. Smith and what they're up to. Their core business is really water heaters, boilers, and water treatment products, which is related to this acquisition. Well, 73% of A.O. Smith's revenues generated in North America, the rest in the rest of the world. I'm intrigued by the company's residential and commercial water strategy or footprint, which really is its business. And why is this interesting to me? We've had a lot of or a number of questions coming up about the role of smart homes, but also just on-site residential commercial water management. So there's just new technology coming out, and it's coming from a lot of different angles. So, A.O. Smith is one who has they've penetrated the commercial and residential market. They have clearly a strong footprint looking at their market share by their different products, but they're also increasingly tied up with organizations like partly through distribution, but like Amazon and other firms. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out as there's greater emphasis on things like energy usage, water management, even at the smaller, more fragmented scale of the residential and commercial markets. And I can tell you it's coming from consumer-based products companies that are going to be focused on it, the big tech companies like the Amazon, the Googles of the world that are already there. So there's no reason that down the road or ultimately companies like A.O. Smith aren't going to have some leverage on what happens within the home. So I'm excited to see this. I think the other thing that's interesting is which is worth noting, is how strong their business has been over the last couple of months. The replacement for home equipment, hot water heaters. I've replaced one myself, in fact. So the replacement rates of that plus new housing has been huge for A.O. Smith. COVID has treated them well in that regard. More hot water you use, the more they use a hot water heater, people are going to wear them out. Also, I think their tankless business is doing quite well themselves. That's another matter. And I put this all in light of what's happening with the recent IPCC report that came out talking about climate, water management. There's a whole section on water management or water-related impacts from climate change. So I thought that was interesting. Don't want to add too much to that. So let's go to news item number 2. A little bit different. Pacífico, for those of you who had Pacífico beer, Pacífico Brewery in Mazatlán in Mexico is accused of owing more than 300 million pesos. That's about $15 million to the city's water authority. It's in litigation right now, and I think the verdict is expected next week, or at least in the middle of this month. State authorities had basically turned off the water supplies to the brewery in July over a payment dispute, and they ended up turning it back on because there are 1,500 employees there without water to the brewery and going anywhere. But the conflict, I think the reason I put this in here is it highlights the interconnectivity between the municipal and industrial companies and authorities. Our team at Bluefield has been analyzing hundreds of thousands of industrial facilities in the U.S. And when we look at food and beverage as a broader group, in the U.S., 98% of them are connected to municipal water supplies. The other 2% are using either surface bodies or treating it and discharging it on their own through permits. So it's interesting to kind of see this conflict happening, whether it be over bills, but also rates as a whole are rising for wastewater discharge. A brewery is a good example. It's rich in organic content, the wastewater effluent, and the utilities are, maybe the base rates are only growing incrementally, but the surcharges on top of that are going up as well. I mean, we're seeing increases of 4 to 6%, and that will likely drive not only wastewater reuse and on-site treatment, but also in some cases, potentially energy capture. Tough business, tough to get some scale, but when there's a bottom line that can be addressed through other ways of saving and the technology is available, it's not like it's a secret or there's no secret sauce to it. It'll be interesting to see what happens. So interesting story about the brewery in Mazatlán. And then lastly, I don't believe I've talked about this, but the demise of High Flux, the pure play water company out of Singapore, has finally come to fruition. The Singapore-based desalination firm, I say that primarily desalination. They've also been active in membrane bioreactors, but in some respects, after failed attempts to recapitalize the company, it's basically on the block now, all its different assets and holdings, whether it be in Singapore or around the world. A couple of takeaways from this: the desal market is lumpy, particularly for firms relying so heavily on the large gold-plated systems in places like the Middle East, or there are a couple plants in California, one operating, but one in development that's large. It's just tough, right? They take a long time to build. There's a lot of, whether it be permitting, environmental pushback, but also financing of these things. The desal market is currently robust, but I think it shows us that, a diversified strategy in this case benefits companies like Veolia or Suez, as it was, and other firms. I know engineering firms are pretty active in it. And then also the Japanese trading houses are investing in these things. So the other thing is, High Flex had also got into energy markets in Singapore itself. It seems to have made a bad bet and got squeezed with a collapse in energy prices. So they basically lost their shirt on that. So this has taken a while to play out, but it seems like the jury has finally laid out its decision, and High Flux is no longer what it was. So interesting to see how this plays out, because it was once a darling several years back. Those are 3 news items. There you have it. So we talked a little bit about A.O. Smith. We talked about the Pacífico brewery and Mazatlán and what's happening there. And then lastly, High Flux. If you have any questions about these topics or others, you can always reach out to me at Water Experts at bluefieldresearch.com, or you can just go to our website. To that point, I thought I'd raise this. Bluefield has just updated its website, so feel free to check it out. There's a different layout now. It's focusing on critical water topics, hopefully clearer than it used to be. And there's also hopefully clear access or a direct path to things like the Future of Water podcast, but also Dave McGimsey's Water Values podcast. Don't forget to check that one out. I know you're listening to the Future of Water right now, but Dave McGimsey does a great job. He's got great interviews. I think his last discussion with Jeff Keitlinger was a really great one. I think it was, as Dave put it, an exit interview. And then once a month, I'm always giving the Bluefield on Tap segment, giving some takeaways. With that being said, don't just follow me on LinkedIn to figure out what's happening. You can increasingly, we're going to be transitioning a lot of things over to our website, including perspectives, which are open to registrants and free at that. So as a reminder, as I always say, sign up to our Waterline weekly newsletter to receive curated news and data from our team of water experts. Every Wednesday, you'll get an email into your mailbox. I think it arrives around 9 a.m. Definitely worth it. We've gotten great feedback about it. It's clean, it's neat, it's tight, and points to a couple of interesting things. It's not everything to everybody, but it also hopefully will open up some questions. Secondly, subscribe to the Future Water Podcast. Yep, this podcast. We want to make this better and more informative, so don't hesitate to reach out to us once again at waterexperts@bluefieldresearch.com with ideas and questions. Curious minds want to know. We want to know what you're interested in. We're doing this for you, not us. And then with that being said, let's get Eric Bindler on the call and see if he can shed some light on what's happening in Atlanta at the Utility Management Conference and other M&A. All right, so I'm joined here today by Eric Bindler, Research Director for Bluefield Research. Eric, how goes it?
Not too bad. I know I'm not supposed to talk about the weather, but we've got some like apocalyptic storms happening outside. So hopefully you don't hear that on the recording.
Well, that's what happens now that you moved to Chicago, you're going to get those things sweeping through town.
Exactly.
Really quickly. Just wait till winter. So, but in any case, great, all of the above to have you on. So let's talk a little bit about, so you and I had the luck of catching up for the first time in person in a year and a half, maybe even more, maybe a year and 3/4 last week in Atlanta, where you and I attended the Utility Management Conference. We were there for different reasons. I was there working with Arcadis and their team on a scenario planning workshop, which I thought was really interesting. And then you were also presenting separately, I think, with Arcadis on a different panel, but also you were attending the conference with our colleague, John Berryman. So, the hope today is that we could talk a little bit about sort of the conference takeaways, to see what people are saying in person as opposed to individual Zoom calls. Then we could talk a little bit about some M&A activity that we find interesting, and in some cases we have some research already out on, but I thought it'd be good to share that with the listeners. But I guess the simple question I have for you, Eric, is: are water conferences dead? What's your take after the conference?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I mean, I think this one was, it's all been a little bit up in the air. Obviously, ACE earlier in the year, I think was primarily virtual. Maybe they did some in-person stuff, but I know that, or actually, no, maybe they did have a component in San Diego, but WEFTech, I think they're planning for in-person in October. The Delta variant obviously putting a lot of wrinkles in people's travel plans. And I do know of some people that were going to be attending UMC that decided to pull out at the last minute just because of concerns around Delta. So, we were kind of curious and not really sure what was going to happen or how it was going to go. But I mean, I think they pulled it off pretty well. I definitely, attendance was way under. I think in the past, they've been getting, the UMC conference has been getting close to, 800-900 people, maybe 1,000 people. This time I heard it was around 400 to 500. So about half, what they've hit in the past couple of years. But, that's not that surprising, especially when you consider that a lot of the audience for these types of events are water utilities, and they may still have travel restrictions in place or just not be able to, and vendors for that matter. I mean, just company-wide, travel restrictions for staff safety. So with all that being said, I mean, I do think that they did a great job. The sessions were all really interesting. People, wore masks and sat far apart, and we did still have opportunities to have some meetings with people, have some great conversations. So I'm hopeful that, we're going to see things continue to pick up. There may be another little pause or a little lapse with Delta, but assuming that we kind of get that back under control, in the relatively near term, then I think people were excited to have an opportunity to be out again, right? I think for me and for many others, the last UMC in February of 2020 was the last event anyone had been to in the industry. So just getting a chance to, get out of your house and and see your colleagues, I think was nice for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think it was interesting. I think you raised, one, it's a conference. I think it was up against some headwinds. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but basically, one, when we agreed to do this 6 months ago, I don't remember when this is all came to be, but I think we felt like, oh, well, people will be vaccinated. We'll sort of, be sort of have some real momentum. And then obviously Delta came about. That's one. Two, it was in Atlanta, Georgia, right? So, if you have travel restrictions, how excited are people to go to Georgia these days? Vaccination rates are low. I think they're really struggling with COVID cases now, probably maybe worse than they were. So that's another aspect. And then I think, there's also just sort of, well, it is August too, right? So I think, time of year, depending on where people's kids are, how much flexibility do they have? So, but all in all, at least I attended a pre-conference workshop on scenario planning with Arcadis, which, I think their turnout was lower than it has been in the past for their workshops, but nonetheless, I thought it was good. It was really interactive. So with that being said, I guess the takeaway is they're not necessarily dead. I think it's going to be a bumpy road because, we haven't, you mentioned ACE, but, WEFTEC is coming up. And typically that draws in the 20,000 range, if you're talking about the trade show. And that's going to be a tough road to hoe, I think, for some of those larger conferences. When this one, it'll be interesting. I know this plays a key role. And also it's for continuing education too. I mean, I think that, it'll be interesting to see whether that's a driver or inhibitor. I know a lot of this stuff has gone virtual, but there's only, so much you can do virtually. And like you said, it's great to see people in person. That one we haven't seen in a while, such as yourself or John that we met down there, but also, yeah, everybody's still trying to figure it out. The situation seems to be fluid. So that's enough of that. That's probably less interesting than your takeaways and, what was the conference about? What was your role? I mean, any key thoughts on what you learned in your conversations with people at the conference?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we had, again, a lot of great sessions kind of covering a range of topics. And I think it's probably fair to point out, the demographics of this particular conference. It's the utility management conference. It's much more geared towards, utility managers, directors, executives, kind of, upper level figures in utilities. And so it's a little bit less technical. It's a little bit more geared towards management, administrative issues. It's mainly utilities. As I said, it's a lot of engineering firms. There's also quite a few digital providers. So obviously that's my kind of wheelhouse. That's my area of interest. So a lot of great kind of people to connect with. It's not really as hardware intensive as, ACE or WEFTEC, where you've got the big trade floor. You've got a lot of pipe companies and pump companies and, treatment tech companies. And so you don't have that same dynamic. It's much more, services and technology kind of thing. So with all that being said, I mean, I'd say a couple just interesting tidbits that jumped out or just concepts that jumped out to me based on, again, the presentations, but also just conversations I had with people. I mean, I think one of the big questions on everybody's mind was COVID and kind of how utilities have managed COVID from a financial perspective, from an operational perspective. I think from a digital perspective, it was really interesting to hear all the different ways that utilities talked about using data, basically, to kind of understand and manage their COVID impacts. And so I heard about, everything from a utility that was using their, daily or weekly AMI data in the early stages of COVID to try to track how their, revenues, how consumption and therefore revenues were changing. And kind of found out, the data was showing that it wasn't looking as bad as they thought it was going to be. And they almost thought it was anomalous data, that the data was wrong because they were bracing for this big hit. And if you remember, back in the first few months, we were seeing these reports of, 17 to 20% revenue impacts for utilities. And they were seeing data that didn't show that. And it was like, okay, maybe this won't be as bad as we thought. And that ended up being how it worked out for them. I also heard about a utility that looked at, use their kind of customer information data to understand their bill delinquencies, right? I mean, one of the big conversations in the industry over the last year was suspending shutoffs for non-payment and what that was going to do to utility finances. And so this utility was really proactive about using data to understand who it was that wasn't paying their bills when COVID hit. And what they found was that I think like 70% of those non-payment accounts, it was the first or second time that they'd ever missed a payment. So it wasn't like your kind of repeat offenders. It wasn't the type of people that they were used to communicating with about non-payment. So they had to kind of devise a new communication strategy to say, hey, you maybe have never missed a payment before, but now you're finding yourself behind. Here's what we can do for you. Here's the assistance that we have to offer and that kind of thing. So really interesting to hear those stories. I mean, I've done a lot of writing about utilities using data, using digital technology to help manage the crisis. But I think also, using data to help understand the impacts of COVID was kind of a new wrinkle in this for me.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, and maybe this is kind of the real takeaway, at least I would interpret it as this, is that it's more real time, right? It may be, so you're not waiting, whether it be till the end of the month, or you're not doing like, hey, at the end of the quarter where you're doing this tally. It gets back to, like I said, I was with Arcadis, we're talking about scenario planning, and there are different types of scenarios that you plan for. One, there are obviously acute events, right? At the time of, the beginning of the pandemic, I mean, it was not expected, not foreseen. Therefore, there was a sudden shock to the system. And I think that's a good example where you don't know what's going to happen, but the sooner you figure that out with real data, the better off you are. So I think that's actually really interesting to see how utilities were able to respond. And I think it was Alcho at Xylem had mentioned this on a podcast. I think it was Water Values podcast. I should know. I want to say it was like maybe end of year edition with Dave McGimsey, but his take was those that prepared after the last recession, who made digital investments, made real concerted efforts to deploy solutions that would better inform them, better enable better asset management, or better prepared today, right? And I think that's a perfect example. It's not like, oh, we don't have any AMI. You can't do that in a week to figure out what's happening, given the sudden shock. So I think that's it's interesting, and it will be interesting to see how things unfold over the coming months or years, for that matter, where we do a bit, while we're still in a pandemic, to at least do some sort of an autopsy on what worked, who were the winners and losers, if you will. So nice. I like it.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe just one other point on COVID before we move on to some other ideas. But I think the other thing that was really interesting to me is, we've talked a lot about kind of the future of the utility business model, right? The kind of volume-based business model where, increased water consumption equals increased revenue. And if you think about it, obviously the picture was very different for utilities around the country, depending on who their customers were, what their mix was for, residential versus commercial versus industrial and what have you. But there were at least a couple of presentations just conversations where utilities, again, we're bracing for the worst, but actually it was, in their part of the country, it was a pretty dry year. So people were still using a lot of water. Not only were they, using water at home, so the residential bills were up, but they were also, having to water their lawns more, or, they were like maybe the big office park in the community, there was nobody there, but they were still watering their lawns, right? They still had landscaping needs and irrigation needs. And so, as much as this was a super disruptive event, it didn't fundamentally change. It didn't impact the utility business model, or didn't kind of undercut the utility business model as much as maybe people were expecting. And I think, if we're talking about scenario planning and kind of long-term crisis planning, COVID is one thing, but obviously there are a lot of, climate impacts that we're looking at that may be a very different story. If you're talking about greater drought or rainier weather, in different parts of the country where, you may not have the same amount of water consumption, period, right? And it may be a bigger shock to the system than, people moving from offices to homes and watering their lawns more. So I think that's something to think about too. I haven't quite wrapped my head around what the long-term implications are. And again, it is so dependent on, geography and on the utility kind of customer mix, what types of businesses they're serving. But it is really interesting to think about, in parts of the country, we talked to a couple of utilities that they're not having the same drought issues that the West is facing, and they're encouraging people to use as much water as they want to. Right? We've heard a couple of people say like flush twice. Right? Is a very different message than what you're hearing in the West with just massive drought.
I mean, to that point, yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, we've been going through an exercise here at Bluefield looking at water reuse and sort of drivers, inhibitors to that market. And it does vary significantly by region. Like if we look at the news, obviously the West is, dry to the bone, and there's not going to be water for a while. We're still in August, so we get a little ways till we get to the rainy season. There are concerns about wildfires and so on. So, and they're now pushing for conservation measures across the state. The governor's pushing for that, whereas here we are in the Northeast, and I don't know, you're not here, Eric, but I mean the reality of it is here I feel like it's been raining every day here. So our issue is it's gotten to a point where it's when you're getting 14 inches in a month of rain, or 15 inches, we're in that range, so I don't want to overstate it, but I may in fact be understating. It feels like it's been raining all the time. And so, yeah, different problems. And like you said, every utility is a little bit different depending on and we had a conversation about this 2 days ago internally. It's like looking at different utilities, which customers, what is their customer mix? How many industrial customers do they have? How many residential do they have? And it depends on the industry, right? If you're, some businesses were more essential or just had to stay open, or they're irrigating, they were fine, more resilient to the shock of remote workforce management, whereas others may not have been. So, no, I like it. I think it's really interesting. And like I said, we're still trying to figure out how COVID or the COVID impacts are going to unfold on the water utilities, and it's certainly going to take a while. What other takeaways? That was one big one. Any others?
Yeah. I mean, I think the COVID one is a big one to unpack, but certainly that wasn't the only topic of conversation. And actually, there's some people that made jokes in their presentations, like, I'm only going to say the word pandemic once in this whole presentation. That's not my focus. So another one that I thought was interesting is kind of the conversation around small to mid-sized utilities, right? The U.S. water sector in particular is, as we all kind of know and talk about often, it's extremely fragmented. The vast majority of utility providers out there in the U.S. are serving hundreds or thousands of people, but there's only a couple that really fall into that close to 1 million or 500,000, 250,000 mark. And so, those bigger utilities make a lot more noise. They're in the news a lot more. They're making kind of flashy investments in new technology and that kind of thing. But we're hearing more and more from the vendor side of the house to kind of dig into solutions for that small to mid-size range and really meet their needs, right? They may have some of the same problems as larger utilities. They also have their own problems. They have different problems. They have different kind of limitations and constraints and just different needs, right? Different pain points and different kind of appetite for technology, whether that be digital or treatment or what have you. But I think one of the things that's kind of standing out to me more and more, and really came to light at this conference as well, is that even within that small to mid-size range, there's still a lot of variety, right? Like you've got, on the one hand, you've got really small rural utilities that may just have like one or two operators total, that they've got no budget, they've got very small customer bases and lower income customer bases, for example. They can't afford really much at all, and it's a very different challenge than if you're talking about the same size community in a suburb in Chicago, right, where you're looking at a small population but a more affluent population, a more tech savvy population, more access to workers, to skills in that community. So I think the geographic difference is a really important one to think about too. And we heard some really interesting presentations about smaller communities that were kind of growing into the next class, the next size, the next tier of utility, and how that shifts their needs. Again, in the suburbs, right? There was a great presentation from a suburb outside of Phoenix, Arizona. And they were saying that they thought that they were the first utility that they were aware of that had basically grown into a new class of regulation, right? They crossed this particular population threshold, and now their EPA monitoring requirements for different types of contaminants had changed. They had more requirements. They had to monitor more frequently, and so they had to very quickly. It's just adding that one extra person, and all of a sudden you've got to do so much more work. You've got to have so much more staff capacity. And so what do you do about that? How does technology help with that? How do professional services firms help with that? It's a really interesting kind of dynamic in just understanding the market opportunity in our industry.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely did research on this, put our research notes, I believe, like a month or two ago. But also, I think we maybe even had a podcast on this. Like, what's the impact of the cloud, right? And I think the cloud enables that in some respects, right? The small, the medium-sized utilities they sort of fall into or being drawn into the addressable market opportunity for a lot of firms, because you don't need to have on-site technical expertise. You don't have to have technical, on-site servers. A lot of this is in the cloud, and basically gives entry to a lot of what I would say specialized or software and or hardware firms, right? So I think that opens the door to that. And I think the other question or point to be made about that is, we've been having a number of different discussions with clients recently about just this demographic shift, trying to figure out how real is it? How many people are moving from Silicon Valley to Boise, Idaho, right? Idaho is one of the fastest growing states in the country, I think now. Trying to figure out how real is that, or how sustainable is that trend? Where are people going to stay there, or is it just they're just fleeing to get away from COVID quarantines and such? And then once everything settles down, ultimately, hopefully, everybody go back to where they are. I mean, given the state of the housing market, it's crazy looking at housing and what's happening. I mean, I mentioned this, I think, earlier in the intro to this podcast, and that is A.O. Smith, who provides hot water heaters. They've got, I want to say, 40% market share in that space, hot water heaters. Their sales for hot water heaters in both the replacement are up. Obviously, people are at home, working from home, using their hot water heaters more and more, I suspect. Therefore, it's putting more strain on these hot water heaters, and they're having to replace a lot of them. But also new housing starts is up. So there's a lot of new build calling for that. So it's kind of interesting to see. So if you're an existing system, I don't know if anybody's prepared, like you're mentioning, suburbs, whether it be Gilbert or wherever, Arizona. I think one of the Olympians from gymnastics team is from Gilbert, Arizona. So shout out to Gilbert, Arizona. But the point being that, if you're prepared to serve 200,000 people, and then you get an influx of a lot more people who are staying there longer, trying to get away, then yeah, it creates more problems. So I think it's interesting to look at sort of the small, mid-sized utility, because that's always been that sort of opportunity out there. There's a real need. Let me put it that way. The question is executing on a business plan or approach to penetrate that market as a vendor or a solutions provider has not always been easy.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was some good, we had some good conversations around what are the tools that a small, let's call it a small rural utility would need, and what are appropriate business models. But what, if you're looking at the kind of software stack out there, what do they actually need? Like what's appropriate for their level of budget, of technical expertise, of just the issues that they're dealing with? It may look very different from, what a large city utility or even a, mid-sized suburban utility is trying to address. How do you kind of find that package or that portfolio of solutions that just makes sense for them and kind of get it into their hands? So I think it's an area that a lot of, honestly, this was kind of a theme, but a lot of the conversations that I had at UMC, I had been having the same conversations with other people either right before the conference or right after the conference. So it's definitely, this issue in particular, the small to mid-sized utility issue is It's, I think, a perennial one, but it's getting more and more attention. And I'm hearing everybody from, utilities to solutions providers to investors, they're all trying to find ways to address this need.
All right. So that being said, Eric, what about a third takeaway from the conference? Any good ones?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot, and I think I'm going to put out maybe a LinkedIn, or I think we have a blog now, right? So I'll do a blog post and hit a few more points. But one other one that I think is worth touching on here is just the mood in the industry is pretty positive right now in terms of just the amount of interest coming into the industry, the amount of investment that we're seeing, especially the amount of M&A. Most of the people that I talked to made some sort of a comment about just how crazy it's been to see just all of the activity, in the past several months. And, I think we write a lot about outsiders looking in. There's all kinds of, whether they be private equity companies or technology companies or players from adjacent sectors kind of finding ways to get footholds in the water industry. There's a lot of that type of activity going on. You've also got the kind of established, the kind of long-term hardware players, hardware market leaders or equipment market leaders or services players that are particularly trying to get into digital. We're seeing a lot of those types of deals as well. And so it was really interesting to hear, we're seeing it and we're talking about it, but it's certainly something that the industry is seeing as well, just this massive amount of interest. And obviously with, all the infrastructure funding that we're hoping will actually come to fruition, to the extent that continues to kind of put attention on the sector, alongside other trends that we talk about, like just increased focus on sustainability and on kind of, climate change. It's really getting more people to think about water and to think about how they can kind of make an impact in the industry.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, it will be, now that the infrastructure bill seems to be moving ahead in some respects, although there's a whole nother package. There's some sort of poker being played as to what happens next, but we don't have to get into that now. That's a separate discussion. But we're related to M&A. I mean, you mentioned this, and that's a big topic. Obviously, we've seen a lot of deal flow, a lot of activity. I know there's been some activity. We put some research out on Suez and Mueller, making some acquisitions over the past month and a half. But also there's this N4 Hexagon deal. Why don't we start there for a second? Because you've raised this with me a couple of times, that the N4 Hexagon deal is actually really interesting. And I know that happened probably a month or so ago, and we've been caught up in other things. So why don't you give us a heads up? What's the story with that deal specifically?
Yeah, no, I think that is an interesting one that kind of flew under the radar a little bit. And, on my end, I think I was moving when it happened. So I saw it when I got back to the office. I was like, oh, this is really interesting. But, so Hexagon is a big Swedish technology company. They've got, in the water industry, they bought a GIS company way back when. So they have some of those capabilities. They have like lots of sensor companies, sensor and surveying and measurement companies, asset performance management. They call themselves a digital reality company, for what that's worth. So they essentially bought an enterprise asset management software suite from Infor. And traditionally, when we've thought of the EAM space for the water industry, it's kind of, there's kind of four big players that are involved at that really the high end of the market, right? The kind of large enterprise software providers that offer this kind of enterprise asset management solution for, again, managing assets for kind of maintaining, doing work orders and maintenance and that kind of thing. We look at it in terms of IBM with Maximo, Oracle with their WAM suite, Infor with their EAM product, and then SAP. There's also a lot of kind of mid-tier players like CityWorks, for example, that's been pushing up and kind of stealing customers from that high end. But when I think about those kind of big four enterprise asset management players, those are the four that come to mind. What's really interesting here is that Infor actually has or had two different kind of versions of the same product, right? They have their own EAM solution, and then they also have the software that they acquired from Hansen way back when, right? And it's much more utility focused. It's got a really big customer base in places like Australia and parts of the US, to the extent that a lot of utilities still refer to it as Hansen rather than Infor, even though it's owned by Infor. So it seems like what's happening is basically Infor is selling one of those products to Hexagon, and they're keeping the Hansen product, and they're going to continue to invest in it and develop it. So we're kind of going from like big four EAM to big five EAM, right? With Infor selling one of their EAM products off to Hexagon. And I think that's going to be an interesting kind of competitive dynamic to see how that shifts the industry, and what that does to some of the mid-tier players like CityWorks or Lucity that are eyeing those larger customers as well. But the other wrinkle in this is that, Koch Industries, right, big diversified industrial player, they acquired Infor last year. They have also, through this deal, made a significant investment in Hexagon. So there's still a kind of relationship between them that will be really interesting to see how it unfolds, because they're now sort of competing, but they do have this kind of shared fate, I guess, in terms of oversight from Koch. So it'll be a really interesting dynamic to see how it all plays out. But definitely something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. And I mean, it is at a level, some of these large diversified companies. And I guess, in this case, I would assume that their reach goes beyond just water, right? I mean, I think so.
Oh, of course. Yeah. It's hard to, I mean, that's the other thing. We thought about doing some research on the Koch Infor deal last year, putting out something on this one. I mean, I think it does go so far beyond water. It's really hard to, while we do look at them because they do have a water impact, it's hard to classify these as digital water deals, right? Because there's so much more. Hexagon is really involved in, they have a big marine division. They have, they do a lot of like manufacturing software. They're really involved in a lot of areas, and enterprise asset management. That type of software can also, and is also used in everything from, utility sector, whether that be water, or electric, or gas, or telecoms, to manufacturing, to really any type of industry where you're managing a large fleet of assets, right? And it's kind of in the name. So yeah, it's not, I wouldn't really call this a water specific deal, but it certainly will have impacts on water. And obviously there are a lot of more water focused players that compete with these companies, right? So, Esri is the big GIS player. Hexagon is kind of one of their competitors from a GIS perspective. There's all kinds of, companies like, as I said, CityWorks or Lucity or Cartograph that are offering, something similar to EAM, to enterprise asset management, that are much more focused on the utility space and on the water space. And so, to the extent that these big diversified enterprise software players are kind of moving things around and making shifts in what their product lineup is, it kind of creates openings, or maybe closes openings for some of those other players.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And I agree with you. Yeah, it's the diversified players are hard to pin down, particularly someone like, a Koch and company. They're private. There's not a lot of information or insights on exactly what's happening sort of behind the curtain. But no, I think this is really interesting. It'll be interesting to see what the ultimate impact is, and also just conversations with the other players, some of which you mentioned, like Esri, CityWorks and such, to see what they're saying and what the potential impact is. And may not be felt now, but certainly their opinions out there. So, well, the other one real quickly is, and we've put some research out on this, Mueller and Suez had made some acquisitions. And now it's been over a month now. Any indications or signals that we can glean from those deals?
Yeah, these were both pretty interesting. These were both in June. They were like about a week apart. And so Mueller bought I2O, and then Suez bought Infomatics. And, there's a couple interesting, we did a research note looking at these two in tandem because there's actually a lot of interesting similarities. I2O and Infomatics are both British companies, right? And the British market is pretty unique in terms of its regulation, in terms of its digital adoption. And, Mueller and Suez are both not UK companies, right? And it gives them an opportunity to potentially get more of a foothold in the UK, but also to take some of those advanced digital capabilities that have been born out of the UK market and the kind of regulatory structure and the requirements of the UK market, and try to find ways to translate them internationally, right? So Mueller obviously has a big North American footprint, trying to take I2O's capabilities and bring them to the US. Suez, global company. Obviously the footprint will change a little bit post Veolia acquisition. This piece that we're talking about will be part of the new Suez, and so they're going to be trying to translate, that Infomatics portfolio to their remaining remaining markets. But so there's the UK and the geographic element. I think it's also interesting to think about what these companies do. They're both pressure monitoring and kind of pressure management companies, and that's there's not a lot of players out there that do it, but I think the idea is being more proactive about understanding pressure within your network can lead to better water quality management, better leak detection. It can also prevent a lot of main breaks, right? I think a lot of really kind of catastrophic main breaks are a result of basically pressure transients, right? You close a valve too fast and it sends a wave of pressure through your pipe network, and it puts pressure on any puts kind of extra strain on any weak points in your network, and that can lead to bursts and a lot of damage, a lot of bad press in the media, for example. So interesting to see kind of advanced digital technologies. It is a really new space. I think it's a pretty small market at this point, but certainly some potential to expand as utilities continue to find look for new ways to just do asset management better, right? To understand what the pain points are, what the pressures are on their network, and kind of prevent those catastrophic failures, as well as deal with the smaller issues like leakage, like non-revenue water that may not be flooding the streets, but they are leading to lost revenue and to just lost efficiencies in operating that network.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there, but for the sake of time, I thought one thing that was interesting is you mentioned the UK market. I mean, in a way, the UK market is a bit of an incubator of digital software solutions technologies. I think we have an analyst who's going through, I think, what do we look at, 945 or so companies active in different aspects of the digital water space globally. And I'm testing my memory here just by looking at a slide deck we talked about yesterday. I think 287 of them are out of the UK alone. If I'm way off base, let me know. But I think the point being is, like, given the market conditions, private water sector, because of the regulatory structure of the market, there's a real push for efficiency, performance, improved performance in the UK market. And as a result, it's incubated a number of different companies. And so obviously Suez and Mueller are hopefully able to leverage some of that, both within the UK, but also elsewhere. So I like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe just the last point on that kind of ties back to the conference, right? And kind of the takeaways from the conference. I mean, we talk a lot about outsiders looking in, and I think that is a major trend to watch. But as I said too, it's also really interesting to see what the insiders are doing and how the insiders are shifting their position. And in this case, you've got Mueller. Traditionally, their core business is hardware, right? They do valves, they do hydrants, they do kind of pipe network hardware. Suez, does a lot of things, but they also primarily like a utility services company. To see those players finding new ways to really add to their digital capabilities, to move in that direction, and we're seeing that across the market. I mean, Xylem is probably the best example, or one of the best examples, but you're seeing so many of the metering companies, the pipe companies, hydrant companies, right? They're all trying to find ways to make their offerings more digital, or to increase their digital capabilities because of that. The higher just the growth opportunities in digital and in data, the higher margin opportunities. And so it's, it kind of goes without saying, but it is really interesting to see the ways that these players are kind of trying to expand their digital footprints in one way or another.
All right. Well, for the sake of time, because I think we've all got things to do, and this is in a research note in this case. So thanks for tying that all together, Eric. So real quickly, what's on your research calendar?
I think, as I said, I'm going to do a write-up on the conference. So I'll get that out there on the internet. Should be fun. And then we've got the analysts working on the company, the vendor database. Really excited to see that take shape. There's a lot of interesting tidbits that we're kind of pulling out of that in terms of who the companies are, where they are, when they were founded, some of the big trends that we're seeing there. Doing some research on the Internet of Things, the IoT market. And then my kind of perennial focus this year is global forecasts. So building out those, just building out our understanding of kind of digital market opportunity and, across Europe, across Australia, New Zealand. So a lot of work to be done on that.
Nice. I like it. Well, Eric, thanks again for stepping up, and it's good to see you. It was good to see you last week, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. So talk soon.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks a lot. Take care.
All right, man. Take care. All right. Before we sign off, please subscribe. Give us a review on Apple Podcasts. Come on, do it. We need your help. Also, you can send us a note at waterexperts@bluefieldresearch.com with any topic ideas you would like us to discuss. We're doing this for you, as I always say. Lastly, tell a friend about it. We're still in a pandemic. It's ongoing. So there's all the more reason to reach out to a friend and say, hey, I listened to this podcast about the water industry. Might be of interest to them. All right. This podcast and these water industry insights have been brought to you by the one and only Bluefield Research. To learn more about us and what we do, visit us at bluefieldresearch.com. Until the next episode, or until you give us a shout out, take care, be safe, be well.